Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. One of the most important albums in jazz history is undeniably Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. Like, for starters, it's the best-selling jazz album ever made, with over 5 million copies sold as of 2019. But more than that, Kind of Blue marked a major stylistic change for the genre with the mainstream arrival of modal jazz. Modal jazz was a slower, more laid-back response to the increasingly frenetic sounds of bebop and hard bop, and Davis was at the forefront of this new movement. But he didn't do it alone. Davis was a longtime friend of composer and theorist George Russell, and at the heart of modal jazz sits one of Russell's most revolutionary ideas: the Lydian Chromatic Concept. First published as a book in 1953, the Lydian Chromatic Concept was Russell's attempt to build a new musical vocabulary from the ground up, one founded directly on the musical practices of jazz. These days, the concept is mostly talked about as an interesting historical curiosity, if it's talked about at all, but I think that's doing a disservice to Russell's work and its legacy, so I decided to learn what the Lydian Chromatic Concept is really all about. Before we get started, quick disclaimer. I tried to find a copy of the original 1953 book, but they're extremely rare and very expensive. Patreon.com/12tonevideos if you want to help me buy old books for research, but in the meantime, I had to settle for an updated version published in 2001. This version expands on a lot of the ideas from the original, but according to everything I could find, the basic model remains roughly the same. This is still the same concept that inspired Miles Davis, it's just that Russell has had more time to think about it and refine it into a more polished, complete shape. Still, since I did that whole historical context thing in the intro, I figured I should be clear about what exactly my sources are. Anyway, on with the video. Like I mentioned, the Lydian Chromatic Concept is an attempt to build a new musical vocabulary from the ground up, so if we want to understand it, we're gonna have to go back to basics. When it comes to harmony and melody, the most fundamental unit of musical information is the interval. Or, okay, I guess technically it's the note, but we can't do all that much with just one note. At its most basic, an interval is just a frequency ratio between two different pitches. Like if I take this G and double its frequency, I get another G an octave up, so the octave has a ratio of 2 to 1. If I instead triple the frequency, I get D a perfect 12th above my starting note with a ratio of 3 to 1. A perfect 12th is just an octave and a perfect 5th stacked on top of each other, so we can combine these two intervals to find that on its own, the perfect 5th has a ratio of 3 to 2. This is the simplest interval that produces a new pitch. That observation leads us to the idea at the heart of the Lydian Chromatic Concept: tonal gravity, and it's surprisingly simple. Basically, Russell claims that if two notes are a perfect fifth apart, then the perceived root of that pair of notes will be the lower one, with the higher one feeling a gravitational pull back down. Quick side note, throughout this video you're often going to hear me say that Russell claims something rather than just saying the thing. That's because many of his arguments are still pretty controversial. Plenty of essays have been written about so-called discrepancies or errors in the Lydian Chromatic Concept, and I get where they're coming from. When I read the book, I often felt like Russell was overstating his case, presenting things as proven facts when they were actually just useful ideas. But ultimately, I think these criticisms miss the point. Russell's not a scientist, he's a music theorist. We don't uncover hidden truths, we build models to describe what we hear and open the door for new kinds of musical exploration. Given the influence of the concept, the impact of modal jazz, and the success of Kind of Blue, it's clear to me that Russell succeeded at that, so I'm not going to waste my time debating the validity of his claims. Instead, I'm simply going to accept them, not as facts, but as axioms, foundational assumptions that are true by definition within this specific context. And I mean, in this case, it's a pretty reasonable claim anyway. The sound of a descending perfect fifth is the basis of the 5-1 resolution that's everywhere in both jazz and classical. Clearly, this idea already resonates with a lot of Western musicians. But Russell isn't satisfied with a simple cadence. No, he argues that this relationship with the perfect fifth and the sense of tonal gravity it creates is the foundation of all music, or at least all music in standard tuning. And to justify that, we're gonna need a bigger model. Specifically, we're gonna need a ladder. Say we're in the key of G. Perfect, now let's play a D. Love it. This is the perfect fifth, which means it feels a strong gravitational attraction to our root. So far, so good. Let's keep going. What about A? Okay, well, this isn't the perfect fifth, so there's no obvious reason it should want to resolve to the root. right? Well, the thing is, A may not be a perfect fifth above G, but it is a perfect fifth above D, and we just saw that D is attracted to G, so A winds up with this sort of indirect attraction as well. It's being pulled back to the root through a note in the middle, and we can keep going like this. E is attracted to A, B is attracted to E, F sharp is attracted to B, and so on, with all of these notes eventually wanting to fall back down to the ultimate center of tonal gravity, which in this case is G. And this ladder can go on forever, but the thing about gravity, and the reason it's such a good analogy here, is that the further away two objects get, the weaker their gravitational attraction. Notes higher up the ladder may still feel some sort of pull back down, but that tendency isn't nearly as clear or as strong as it is when we're closer to the source. And this runs into further problems because, unlike the universe, pitch space is cyclical. It wraps around on itself. If we keep going up for long enough, eventually we'll reach another G. But let's stop one rung before that. If we're in the key of G, what happens if I play a C? This is 11 perfect fifths above the root. The gravitational attraction is still there, but it's pretty trivial. We just can't hear the entire ladder it's built on. But C isn't just 11 perfect fifths above G, it's also 1 perfect fifth below G, and tonal gravity doesn't discriminate. C is pulling on G much more strongly than G is pulling on C. This makes the C a destabilizing force, competing with the root for dominance. To account for this, Russell divides the notes of a key into two categories, which he calls ingoing and outgoing. Ingoing notes exist near the bottom of the ladder, and they point back down toward the center of tonal gravity. In any given key, the ingoing notes in order of increasing distance are the root, the perfect fifth, the major second, the major sixth, the major third, the major seventh, and the augmented fourth. And, quick side note on the augmented fourth. This is actually just as far away in both directions. It's 6 perfect fifths above the root and 6 perfect fifths below it. In principle, that means we could read it as perfectly balanced, neither ingoing nor outgoing, but Russell doesn't do that. He seems to view attraction to the root as the default state, so while in theory the sharp 4 could go either way, in practice it makes more sense to say it's pointing down. But this is where things get really interesting. If we take those 7 ingoing notes and rearrange them to look like a scale, we don't get major, we get Lydian, basically major with a sharp 4. And this leads Russell to probably his most controversial claim that Lydian, not major, is the fundamental basis of Western tonality. This one gets a lot of pushback because, well, if that were true, then why do so many composers write in major? But I don't think that's quite what he's saying. It's not that we're secretly writing in Lydian, it's more that we're secretly hearing in Lydian, or at least hearing in relation to Lydian. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one. Lydian isn't necessarily the color of the music, it's more like the paint palette. It's where the color comes from. But so far, we've just derived the Lydian scale. What makes it chromatic? Well, for that we're going to need to add the rest of the notes. If the ingoing notes serve to affirm the center of tonal gravity by pointing toward it, then the outgoing notes do the opposite, disrupting the center of tonal gravity by pulling against it. And just like the ingoing notes, that pull can be more or less extreme depending on the distance from the root. Let's go back to our ladder. Now, you might think that we could just find the order of the outgoing notes by continuing to go up in fifths, and yeah, in theory we could. But Russell doesn't do that. Not quite. You see, if this is the correct order, then that means the most consonant outgoing note, the one that's most comfortable and familiar and that musicians are most able to mix in with minimal disruption, is the minor ninth. Yikes. Okay, so that might seem like a pretty big red flag for the theory. It's making a bold prediction that doesn't really reflect what musicians actually do. Fortunately, Russell's a clever guy and he noticed this problem too. In order to save the model, he decided to accommodate this particular practice by simply skipping the minor ninth on the ladder, going up 2 perfect fifths between the sharp 4 and the next note. This gives us a much more logical order for the outgoing notes. In order of increasing dissonance, we have the flat 6, the flat 3, the flat 7, the 4, and then he just slaps the flat 9 back on at the end to complete the set. Is it a bit of a hack? Sure, and he acknowledges that. He specifically describes this modified version of the ladder as the Western order of tonal gravity because it makes this one concession to Western tonal practice. And as much as I love a good clean model, I can't really say I blame him. The idea as a whole still has a lot of promise, he's just smoothing out one rough edge to make it actually work for the music he wants to describe. So okay, now we have our complete Lydian chromatic scale, a definitive ordering of all 12 notes from the most ingoing to the most outgoing, at least in the context of Western Western tonality. What do we do with it? Well, we do what Western musicians have always done with collections of notes. We make scales. Specifically, Russell defines 7 principal scales, each of which represents a different level of outgoing complexity. The simplest of these, containing only the ingoing notes, is, of course, the Lydian scale. In Russell's system, this is the most natural, most resolved scale possible. This is our home base, our foundation, and everything else should be understood in relation to it. The next group are the Lydian-derived scales. Here we take the normal Lydian scale and replace one of its ingoing notes with an outgoing note. The most resolved of these is Lydian-augmented, where we take the 5th of Lydian and replace it with the first outgoing tone, the flat 6. Or actually, it might be easier to think of it as a sharp 5 in this case, but, you know, same thing. After that, we have Lydian diminished, where we replace the major 3rd with a second outgoing tone, the flat 3. These two scales, combined with basic Lydian, represent what Russell calls the consonant nucleus. They use only the mildest of outgoing notes, and between the 3 of them, you can build all the basic chord types in traditional Western harmony. While some of them do get a little spicy, that spice is well contained within the powerful ingoing sound of Lydian. But there's one Lydian-derived scale left, Lydian dominant. Here we replace the major 7th with a 3rd outgoing tone, the flat 7. Now we're starting to get into more strongly outgoing territory. The flat 7 is only 2 perfect fifths below the root, so it has a pretty strong gravitational pull. This puts Lydian dominant outside the consonant nucleus, but it's still an important sound. I should note though that this seems to be one of the few differences between the original 1953 text and the updated 2001 version I'm using. Again, I couldn't find the original, but I did find a discussion of it in a 1998 book called In the Course of Performance. In her chapter on modal jazz, Ingrid Monson says that Russell defined 6 basic scales as opposed to the 7 he used in my book, and the list she provides doesn't include this one. If I had to guess, I'd say the reason Russell left it out is because having a Lydian-derived scale with a flat 7 blurs the line between those and his other set, the auxiliary scales. These are a collection of symmetrical scales that employ the more potent outgoing notes in a clear, systematic way. They aren't directly based on Lydian, but they do all feature a sharp 4. First, we have the auxiliary augmented scale, which you may also know as the whole tone scale. It's just a series of whole steps stacked on top of each other. This exists on the same tonal level as Lydian dominant because it doesn't use anything more outgoing than the flat 7, but because it also includes a flat 6, the structure is still more disruptive. Next we add in the 4th outgoing tone, the 4th. Huh, that's fun. Anyway, with this comes our next auxiliary scale, the auxiliary diminished. Again, this is a well-established scale consisting of an alternating pattern of whole steps and half steps. And finally, we bring in our last outgoing tone, the flat 2 we skipped earlier, to make the auxiliary blues diminished, which has an alternating pattern of half steps and whole steps, basically the same as our last scale, but backwards. Russell also defines 4 of what he calls horizontal scales, which are scales that don't really fit in with his model, but are worth mentioning anyway for their cultural significance. The most important of these is, of course, major. I won't go through all of them, but what sets these apart from the other scales we've covered, which Russell calls vertical scales, is that the horizontal ones all contain a perfect 4th. Or, okay, auxiliary diminished also had a 4th, but that was incidental. These are structural. And that creates a problem because the 4th has the strongest gravitational pull away from the root. This leads to an interesting dichotomy between the two scale types. According to Russell, vertical scales with their sharp 4s are passive, sounding in perfect unity with the root. You can play any note you want and it'll just kinda work. Horizontal scales, on the other hand, are active, always stuck in the process of resolving to their root, but never being fully resolved. It's like they've got this second intrusive root that keeps popping in and demanding attention. So, alright, we've got scales, but this is jazz we're talking about, and traditionally in jazz, chords are king. So how do we turn this into chords? Turns out that's pretty simple, because according to Russell, they already are. Or rather, he argues that a chord is, in effect, an incomplete voicing of a scale, and a scale is a melodic realization of a chord. The two concepts are intrinsically linked to the point where we can kind of refer to them interchangeably. But how do we figure out which scale a chord is? Well, most of the basic chord types can already be found somewhere in plain old Lydian. In fact, some of them show up more than once, but Russell solves that by introducing the concept of a parent scale. This is the most natural Lydian scale to work from for any given chord, and we can find it by walking up our ladder again. If we start with the root, we find we can build a major 7th chord on top of it, using just notes from its own Lydian scale. In fact, we can build all sorts of major chords. We can do a major triad, a major sixth, major ninth, major 7 flat 5, whatever. Basically, all the major chords belong to the root of the Lydian scale, so whenever we see a major chord, we know its parent scale is a Lydian scale built from its own root. Simple. Moving up the ladder, we have the fifth, but in Lydian, the chord built on the fifth is also a major seventh. Awkward. Let's skip this. Next is the second, from which we can build a dominant seventh. That's more like it. This means the parent scale of the dominant seventh, and most other dominant chords, is the Lydian scale built from the note a whole step below its root. That's... okay, this is getting a little conceptual, so let's try a quick example. If I play A7, we know that because it's dominant, we should think of it as being based on the second note of some kind of Lydian scale. That's where dominants are born. And if A is the second note, that means G is the root, so if we see A7, we think G Lydian. Now, in terms of performance, we should still think of A as the root of the chord and use the scale in a way that highlights it, but the underlying structure is still G. Again, Lydian isn't the color of the sound, it's the palette. Anyway, continuing up the ladder, we get the sixth, which makes our first minor seventh chord. And we can do the same thing. If we hear E minor 7, we know it's based on the sixth of a Lydian scale, and again, the root of the scale that E is the sixth of is G. This means that minor chords in general should typically be thought of as coming from the Lydian scale built on the chord's third. The next couple steps on the ladder just give us more minor seventh chords, but eventually we make our way to the sharp 4, which is the root of a half diminished 7. And again, same thing. If we follow this chord back to its Lydian root, then the parent scale of C sharp half diminished is G Lydian. But we still have a couple chord qualities left that don't exist anywhere in the basic Lydian scale. For those, we'll have to expand our search to the rest of the consonant nucleus, the set of scales derived from the first 9 notes of our ladder. Probably the most important chord that lives here is the augmented dominant, which can be found on the flat 6 of Lydian augmented, so if we have E flat augmented 7, then the parent scale is G Lydian augmented. We can also find the diminished 7 and the augmented major 7 on the roots of Lydian diminished and Lydian augmented, respectively. These chords are inherently a little more exotic because they can't be traced back to a parent Lydian, but we can still work with them if we know where to look. So okay, we've got a parent scale. Does that mean we just play that scale over that chord and we're good to go? Nah, or not necessarily anyway. The parent scale is just the most natural choice, the one that maximizes the ingoing tendency of the chord. But if we don't want that, we can swap it out for any of our other scales built on the same root. Once we've identified that E minor 7's parent scale is G Lydian, we can approach it using that scale, or we can use G Lydian dominant, G auxiliary diminished, or whatever. All of these scales sound in unison with the Lydian root G, so all of these scales can be used over any chord that G is the parent of. Russell does mention that things get a bit weird if you choose a scale that doesn't contain the root of your chord, but that's still an option if you really want. You could even use one of the horizontal scales, or you can just make up your own. The point isn't the specific notes, it's how you find them and how you use them. And this was the thing modal jazz players latched onto. In the bebop era, improvisation was driven primarily by chord changes. You'd have these rapidly changing chords, and the goal of a soloist was to play the right notes to fit with each one in turn. A good chord progression was a mix between a roadmap and an obstacle course. You couldn't just take the solo you played on Autumn Leaves and play it again on Crimea River because the chords were different. But what Miles Davis and his band realized was that they didn't need a guide holding their hand anymore. They were good enough to make something beautiful and unique without any restrictions, or at least without the aggressively imposed structure of chord changes. So they left the chords behind and chose to focus instead on melodies and scales. Like, take So What, the first track off Kinda Blue. Here, at the start of Davis's solo, they just sit on a D minor 7 chord for the first 16 bars. Or, I mean, technically there's often no chord at all. The only harmonic instrument is Bill Evans's piano, and he often lays out for multiple bars at a time. So it's less that the chord is D minor 7, and more that the scale is. The parent scale of D minor 7 is F Lydian, and for these first 16 bars, almost everything Davis plays is drawn from that scale. He's playing in a way that emphasizes notes like D, A, and C, and combined with a pitch collection of F Lydian, this focuses your ear on a sort of elemental D minor sound, no actual chords required. That gives Davis the freedom to do literally whatever he wants. Chord changes are finite, and once they're done they have to repeat, but a scale can go on forever. Or okay, the solo does eventually spend some time in E flat minor as well, but the point is that by backing off on the complexity and density of the chords, Davis is forced to find new, clever ways to keep this one harmonic space interesting. It's a new challenge, and one that Davis and his band clearly rose to. And that's the big idea here, but the Lydian Chromatic Concept is more than just a model. It's a toolbox, a philosophy, and a new musical vocabulary. No one video is going to capture all the nuances of what Russell was trying to do. So if any of this seemed interesting to you, and if you made it this far, I hope something did, I would really recommend finding a copy of the book and reading Russell's thoughts in his own words. It can be a challenging read, but it's a very thorough exploration of exactly how one of the greatest minds in jazz thought about his craft, and while we don't talk about it as much these days, the legacy of the concept is impossible to deny. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Kevin Wilamowski, Grant Aldonas, Michael Mole, and Damian Fuller-Sutherland. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.